All right, so we are now recording, and I have my guest, Professor Bruce Gore. I'm gonna call him a professor because I have to put something in front of his name. He's an esteemed man in my eyes. So, uh, Professor, why don't you go and tell us about yourself?
Well, that could take quite a while, you know. I grew up in a small town not far from Spokane, Washington. It's called Grand Coulee. It's where Grand Coulee Dam is. Grew up in a Baptist background. And when I was graduating from high school, I was a musician. That was at least one of the things I was interested in. So I got a small scholarship in music to go to Whitworth University, which was then called Whitworth College. And so I went to Whitworth and attended there for 4 years, graduated with a major in psychology of all things. And the only reason I can think of that I graduated majoring in psychology was because I tried every other major and I didn't like the rest of them. And psychology was the only thing left, you know. If I could go back and do it again, I would have been a history major, probably in a heartbeat. But as it turns out, all the years of my education in my small town school, I had taken history from people that didn't like history, and so I assumed that history was not a worthwhile pursuit, and I just avoided it. But once I got out of Whitworth, I was in broadcasting for a while, Christian broadcasting, so I was on the radio for a few years, but bluffed my way into a job teaching in a little Bible school here in Spokane that started in 1973 that was called Inland Empire School of the Bible. And I'm not quite sure how I got the job, but I was able to at least muscle my way into one class, which was in speech. And eventually the job morphed into a full-time position. And so I taught there for about 5 to 6 years. I kind of consider that my seminary because I had to teach virtually everything in the curriculum at some point or other. And it gave me an opportunity to have to do a lot of preparation and thinking. And one of the interesting things that happened was when I started teaching there at that school, I was pretty well committed to a kind of dispensational background. I think you probably know what that means. And by the time I had taught there 6 years or so, especially teaching church history, I had become so impressed with the quality of the thinkers in the history of the church, the depth of their insight, the level at which they approached Christian topics, and none of them had ever heard of dispensationalism. And in fact, what they taught emphatically would have been contradictory to such a view. And so it began to loosen my mortar a little bit. And eventually, over about 5 or 6 years, I just came to the point that I couldn't continue in good conscience to teach there because they required that you be, without, as they put it, mental reservation, committed to a dispensational outlook. And so on very friendly terms, there was never any hard feelings, but I resigned in about 1980. I had become so impressed, however, with history and the process of teaching history that I decided to go and get a master's degree in history, which is kind of tough to do when you've never taken a decent history course, to go out and drop yourself in the middle of a bunch of history majors, you know. So I was pretty well floundering for a couple of years, but was able to get through. And my major area of interest in that MA program was Puritan, colonial Puritanism and English Puritanism. And that really did capture my imagination. And so from that time on, really, I've been, that's been one of my major areas of interest. But I was also impressed doing those studies that the Puritans were great lawyers. They had a very profound understanding of law. They were well informed by biblical principles of law and also worked out a lot of principles of jurisprudence, especially when they were really thrust into important leadership positions, both in England, but also, of course, coming over to the colonies in the US. They were put to the task of really inventing a legal system. And they did so in a very impressive way. And that kind of got me thinking about law. So after 2 or 3 years, law school and graduated 3 years later, practiced law for about 20 years. And then in the early 2000s, I'd done enough of law to have, kind of been there, done that kind of thing. And the legal practice that I had was mostly trial work, which tends to be a relentless mistress. And so I eventually decided I'd see if I could do something that had a somewhat lower stress level involved, and was able to get a job in a private Christian school, high school here in Spokane. So the last 10 years or so that I was working, I was teaching high school seniors classes like philosophy and Bible and hermeneutics and economics and a few others that came along, New Testament Greek and so on. And so I eventually retired from that. That was about 5 years ago, I suppose. And since then, I've been happily retired. I'm married to my lovely wife, Candy, who's overhearing this conversation, and she's going to slap me if I say anything wrong. And I have 4 kids and 18 grandkids. So there's the whole story right there.
Wow. That's impressive. So you mentioned dispensationalism and the kind of the early church fathers and how they kind of taught kind of contradictory, and you said to that from your understanding.
Well, yeah, it's a complicated story, because in the 2nd century, you would certainly have to honestly grant that a lot of the thinking that circulated in the church at that time, 2nd century, did have what you'd call a premillennial understanding,
sure,
believing that Christ was going to return at some point. And for the most part, they thought it was going to be pretty soon,
yeah,
and establish a kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And so dispensationalists, who of course take that view, like to refer to that and say, well, hey, that's what the early church taught, so what part of that don't you get,
Yeah.
Well, I grant that. I'm certainly aware that it wasn't a universal view, but certainly there were plenty who took that position. I think the reason for that, honestly, is that there was still a highly Jewish influence in the church, and that had been the Jewish understanding for centuries, that Christ would come as a political character and establish a kingdom. And so even though I'm not so sure the New Testament teaches that, it was still kind of in the DNA of a lot of the culture of early Christian thought, which still tended to be quite Jewish in its outlook.
Okay.
By the 3rd century, that particular view was losing ground fairly rapidly, and certainly by the time you get to even the days of the Council of Nicaea, let alone the time of Augustine, that whole concept had, for the most part, been dismissed and seen as representing a misunderstanding of what the New Testament actually taught. And so that would be the closest you would get to what you might call a dispensational outlook in the very early church. However, the early 1800s, that view was revived in a big way through the birth of dispensationalism, largely through the influence of John Nelson Darby, who was one of the founders of the Plymouth Brethren, and he worked out a quite elaborate system of eschatology that incorporated in it a premillennial outlook, but also a fair number of other details that went beyond anything the early church had ever mused on. Things like the displaced 70th week of Daniel, a 7-year tribulation, a rather complicated view of a pre-tribulation rapture. All of that would pretty much be a novelty of the dispensationalism that was developed by Darby. Some people want to argue that, and they'll point to somewhat obscure references here and there in church history that at best are ambiguous. But I'd say any fair-minded reviewer of the evidence would say that Darby was the one who was kind of really an inventor of a view of eschatology that became very influential in subsequent years.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And so just to make sure we kind of get some good descriptions and what you referred to that came up earlier in the church would now be referred to as a historic premillennialism, correct?
I'd say so. That'd be a good
Yeah.
term to use for it. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And what John Nelson Darby espoused would be known as classical dispensationalism.
That's true.
Yeah.
He certainly put the underpinnings in place. It was modified. It has been continually modified over the
Mm-hmm.
years, but Darby was the original architect of
Okay.
the fundamental ideas. They were picked up by C.I. Schofield in America, revised, to some noticeable extent
Mm-hmm.
by Schofield. And of course, the history of dispensationalism in America, at least, has been one in which uh, basically the outlook has changed. It's changed, I think, in fairly measurable ways. Back in the 1960s, the late 60s, uh, Ryrie published a book, a professor at Dallas Seminary at the time, called Dispensationalism Today.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it was an attempt to revise what dispensationalism had looked like in the days of Schofield, let alone in the days of Darby. So nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying it has been a somewhat fluid view, but Darby certainly put in place fundamental principles that, to a large extent, continue to be an important part of dispensational teaching.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just to clarify, for those who are going to watch this video, I want to be sure that you understand that a lot of the current dispensational views you run into fall under a different category, which would be progressive dispensationalism. That's kind of
Mm-hmm.
that's a kind of I guess espoused by theologians like Darrell Bach, and people like that. So, and that's kind of interesting because I know you do an entire talk on Dallas Theological Seminary and how that kind of came to be, which had a lot to do with C.I. Schofield. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, in
all that.
fairness, I say that Dallas today is not the Dallas that was founded by Louis Sperry Schaefer under the influence of Schofield. Dallas is a respectable institution today.
Absolutely.
And they turn out some quite high-powered scholars. And so whatever their history is, I wouldn't want that to be some kind of negative judgment as to the institution today.
Yeah, actually, some of my favorite theologians kind of come out of there, especially in terms of New Testament, New Testament textual criticism. So a lot of it's a great school, and I know a lot of great scholars who have come out of there. Okay, so let's see. I guess we can kind of flow into the discussion in terms of the dating of the Book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
We'll kind of start there, the historical backdrop. I think that'll be a good place to start.
Okay. Well, you probably know that there are basically two schools of thought. There may be others, but these are by far the dominant views. The majority view is that Revelation was written toward the end of the first century and was triggered by a persecution that was quite short but fairly intense by the Roman emperor at the time, whose name was Domitian. And the view is basically the result of a comment that's made by the church father Irenaeus, who was writing about the year 180. So about 100 years after the fact, he wrote very briefly on the topic, didn't expand on it at all, but there's one critical sentence in his great work Against Heresies, in which he appears to say that Revelation was produced under the reign of Domitian, which would put the date around 95 AD. And that has and continues to be to this day a majority view. The question as to whether or not Irenaeus said that is itself an open question. The Greek that he used at that point was frankly ambiguous. And I mean, I read Greek and I understand it, and although I don't consider myself fluent in ancient Greek, but I think anyone that knows Greek would see that it is at least not clear cut. He may have meant 95. I'm not going to dispute that point. I'm just saying he didn't say it very artfully. The phrase itself has been subjected to extraordinary technical analysis. I'm sure Irenaeus himself would be stunned at how much interest has been paid to that particular phrase. And it has to do with how you understand the participle in the sentence, and I won't go into the technical details of it. Just suffice it to say that, at least on the face of it, even the ancient readers had the impression that that's what he meant. And so I'm willing to grant maybe that was what he meant, but I'm not sure it's an absolutely open and closed case. However, there has always been, and I think it's safe to say in more recent years, there's been a growing interest in viewing Revelation not as a product of a persecution that took place in the late first century, but rather a product of a persecution that was much more intense, much more widespread, and it lasted longer and would certainly create more of a rational context for a production like the Book of Revelation, and that is under the reign of Nero. And so that particular view, frankly, I started off taking the Domitian view myself back in the day, and I was kind of rattled in my thinking by hearing a series of lectures by a man who was a pretty well-known scholar. He was the pastor of University Presbyterian Church in Seattle. You may know the name Earl Palmer. And Earl did a series of sermons and lectures on Revelation in which he argued quite emphatically that the view of a late date for Revelation is just flatly wrong. And he gave multiple reasons for that and cited multiple pretty credible sources that helped to basically frame his own opinion. And I have to say, I struggled with it for about, 6 months, but it became pretty clear to me that I think the better view is the earlier date, which leads a person to wonder, well, how come the late date is still so widely accepted? If the case can be made pretty convincingly for an early date, as I believe it can, then why are there still so many people that subscribe to a late date for the Book of Revelation? And I think the explanation, there's several, but I think one is just habit. I think people have been in the habit of thinking of the late date, and so they just take it for granted without necessarily critically evaluating the evidence either way, even among fairly credible scholars. Sometimes there's a tendency to just kind of accept the common wisdom. It's been without necessarily looking at it with a high degree of detail. But I think there's something else here as well, because if you look at the bulk of those who take the late date view, they fall into one of two kinds of scholars. You'll either have what you would generally call liberal scholars, who really don't necessarily subscribe to the notion that the Bible is inerrant, infallible. It may be influenced by God's Spirit in somehow or other, but there's still loads of problems in it, lots of contradictory information, etc. And so a liberal scholar taking the late date notices that there are all kinds of predictions in Revelation that speak of a catastrophe that is going to happen in the near future, because Revelation is quite clear on the point, quite explicit. These things are about to happen. And the liberal scholar says, well, look, it didn't happen. I mean, nice try, foul ball. You thought these things were going to happen. The reason they say it didn't happen is because, number one, the city that apparently is the subject of this catastrophe in Revelation is Jerusalem. And Jerusalem manifestly was not even populated, or was only barely populated in the late first century, certainly doesn't represent anything like a metropolis that's contemplated in Revelation. So The scholars that are more liberal say, well, Revelation must have been speaking of Rome, that the great Babylon, the great harlot city, must have been Rome. And manifestly, Rome didn't go through any catastrophes. So a liberal scholar will simply reach the conclusion, this was a well-meaning apocalyptic writer who was thinking things were going to go a certain way, and they didn't. But we can still, kind of congratulate ourselves that it's an interesting book, and we should read it, and it probably gives us some general help, that kind of thing. So that's one kind of school of thought that is that's associated with the late date. The other class generally of folks that take the late date are those who would be in a more either historical premillennial or especially dispensational view, and they would take what's called the Futurist view of Revelation and say, well, the reason that Revelation talks so much about Jerusalem as the great city that would sustain all of these catastrophes is because it's speaking of a Jerusalem that would be rebuilt well into the future, and that thousands of years in the future, we're going to have an opportunity to see the catastrophes that are described in Revelation take place. And the only difficulty with that is, of course, that Revelation says repeatedly, emphatically, and explicitly that these things are about to take place. Intoxe is the Greek phrase there, and there is no honest way to construe that phrase except to mean things that are about to happen in the very near future. I know all of the hocus pocus that's applied to that phrase to try to make it say something else, but the fact of the matter is, anybody reading that in the first century or second century who read Greek or spoke Greek would never, ever draw the conclusion that what is being stated there is to be construed as referring to events thousands of years in the future. That would be viewed simply as dishonesty on the part of the book, not an alternative view of what the book actually says. So there, to me, that at least accounts for, to some degree, the persistence of the late date view. Dispensationalists want the late date because they don't want it to apply to the rule of Nero, which really destroys their whole eschatological system based on Revelation. The liberals prefer the late date because it shows that the book of Revelation got it wrong. Well, there's always been a vocal minority who have taken the view that, we should take another glance at this. Number one, the statement from Irenaeus, while it's interesting and important, is not dispositive. Irenaeus is not the Bible, and Irenaeus got a lot of things wrong. He's a great source. We ought to read him, but Irenaeus is not the infallible commentator on anything. He's a great guy. I like him, and so that's fine. But we shouldn't let the whole case rest on him. Others after Irenaeus agreed with him, but again, I think agreed with him somewhat uncritically. Clement of Alexandria, others tended to follow Irenaeus without necessarily examining the case independently. There is from the point of view of internal evidence in Revelation, I think almost compelling to the point of irrefutable weight that argues that the book was written under Nero. And while there's many ways that this could be argued, I think probably the most compelling, at least the sort of the bedrock of it, is number one, Jerusalem is manifestly the so-called great city that is discussed in the book. Chapter 11, speaking of the characters known as the two witnesses, are said to have their bodies lying in the street of the great city that is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. There's no ambiguity about that. That's about as plain as one could hope to find any statement in the book. And so we know that this city, which is called the great city, must be Jerusalem. And we can also infer that there can only be one, the great city. You wouldn't expect to have multiple cities qualifying for that. Not only is Jerusalem still standing, but the book of Revelation presupposes the temple is still standing, because there's multiple references in Revelation to the temple. John is told in chapter 11 to measure the temple, literally the naos, the inner sanctum, the holy of holies. It is figurative, but still the very fact that he's being told to do something with respect to the temple, and the temple is referred to multiple times elsewhere in Revelation, all would suggest that these statements would be nonsensical if the city and indeed the temple weren't still standing. In chapter 17, you have what probably is the most compelling argument of all, although I think it's not the only one, but it's certainly one that carries a lot of freight, in which we're told of the seven heads are seven hills, we hear, on which the woman sits. And so obviously the city of seven hills is Rome. The woman is said to sit on those seven hills, which leads some people to think, well, maybe the woman is Rome. The difficulty with that is later in the same chapter, that same city of seven hills makes war against the woman. In other words, you can't have the woman be Rome, when in fact, by the time the chapter is over, Rome is the one making war against the woman. They are two different things. But certainly it's the case that the woman was resting on Roman power, just as we find in the New Testament. The Roman influence in the life of Israel was powerful, and the religious elite were certainly in bed with Rome. So that's really the sense of it. But more importantly, it also says the seven heads are seven kings. 5 have fallen, one is, the other is not yet come. But when he does come, he'll remain for only a little while. Well, the seven kings manifestly at that time would have been the seven emperors, seven rulers. And there were exactly 5 of them that had fallen, beginning with Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. 5 have fallen. Then Nero. Nero is the 6th. He's the one that was still there. And then the next one that came was Galba, but he only reigned for a little while. That has been viewed even by critical scholars as powerful evidence in favor of an earlier date. There's a scholar who was, for many years, she's now deceased, but at the time, for many years, she was the premier Bible scholar of Notre Dame, Josephine Massingburg Ford, who wrote a powerful, very helpful commentary on Revelation. She's, somewhat liberal in her outlook, but she said, that at least a substantial part of Revelation manifestly has to apply to the persecution under Nero. She took the view, trying to accommodate the late date folks as well, that Revelation came out in 2 editions. So there was an early edition, which was generated under Nero, and then a later revision generated under Domitian. And then she goes into a lot of work to try to show which part was which and so on. But
so
the point I'm making is, pardon me?
So how did she come to that conclusion?
Well, she was trying to accommodate the many, many people who take the late date, and yet at the same time face the fact that Revelation certainly had to at least been written in part under Nero because of the internal evidence. So, it was kind of a novel theory. I don't know how many people have followed it, but it just shows how compelling the case can be made. So anyway, for my money, it seems to me that for that and other reasons as well, by far the preferable view. It certainly makes Revelation make way more sense to see it in terms of the events that were taking place in affecting the Christian church, but especially leading up to the devastating, destructive impact of a Roman attack on Jerusalem that took place and was culminated in 70 AD. And so that's become my view of it. It's the perspective from which I teach it. I think it's the right view, but obviously the conversation still goes on.
Okay. So I have a quick question. So, and just to kind of give a little background. So how would you come to the conclusion that the seven hills is in fact Rome?
The city of Seven Hills was, it is today, and it was then, a standard kind of colloquialism referring to Rome. So the city of Seven Hills, you'll still hear that. Rome was founded by Romulus back in 753, and it's interesting that if you survey the kings that ruled in Rome over the next couple of hundred years, they would famously add hills, because Rome was founded in a region where there were these kind of low kind of hills, or shallow mountains, you might say. And as Rome expanded, they kept adding hills up to seven. And so the nickname was actually established early on in Roman history, certainly by the time of the Roman Republic in 509 BC, that it was the city of Seven Hills. The book of Revelation, as is the case of the whole New Testament, in fact, the whole Bible, presupposes what you might call local color, local lore, local phrases, that kind of thing. And certainly this would be a commonly understood view of the matter. So I think it's probably not overly debatable in most folks' minds that a city of Seven Hills would be referring to Rome.
Okay, awesome. Okay, is there anything else you wanted to add to that portion?
Well, not unless you've got a further question on it. I think, there's more that can be said, but I think that's probably the fundamental, those would be the kind of the main points where you'd want to start this discussion.
Okay. I would say definitely some good resource that I've benefited from is Kenneth Gentry. He does a lot of work on the book Revelation. He makes the same argument. In fact, he did his dissertation, especially on the Greek and that Irenaeus talked about.
His book, Before Jerusalem Fell, is really great reading on this. And he makes a quite compelling argument. And then the other one that's pretty good is his the book, The Mark of the Beast.
I got that one too.
In which he goes through and develops the 666 nomenclature that you find in chapter 13, and again makes a pretty compelling case that really couldn't be referring to anyone except Nero. And of course, he's a brilliant guy. He makes a lot of other good arguments, but those especially, I think, are important.
Would you mind kind of walking us through that very briefly? Some of the evidence, because I'm trying to find things that are really pinpoint the time, historical place in terms of where the book of Revelation is. And I think that point is a great one. So if you can kind of talk on that a little bit.
Which,
it doesn't have to be extensive. The Mark of the Beast.
The Mark of the Beast, yeah. Well, it's I think the key to understanding that is to realize that in the first place, in the ancient world, there was not a separate set of letters and numbers. We have the letter A and we have the number 2, for example. The number 2 is not any particular letter, and the letter A or B or D is not any particular number. Those are two independent sets of symbols that we use to do, in the one case, mathematics, and in the other case, written literature. In the ancient world, there was not a separate set of digits. The closest you get to it was the Roman numeral system, but even those were letters. If you look at the letter 5, it's actually the letter V. I mean, that kind of thing. And it was commonly understood that letters and numbers, the same symbols could be used for both. So to say the number of a person's name was a fairly sensible thing to say. Anybody's name had a particular numeric value. You would take the letters of your name, and by adding them up, you could say, here's the number of your name. Numbers might have a number, for example, in the Greek numeric system, some numbers were just single digits, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Some had multiple values, 10 or 20, 30, that kind of thing. So you could get a pretty sizable number out of the Greek alphabet. The numeric value, for example, of the name of Jesus in Greek is 888, interestingly, so that kind of thing. Which is quite interesting, and it's on its own. It's sort of an interesting thing because you think of 8 as the 8th day of the week, the day that Christ rose from the dead, that sort of thing. But in the case of Nero, it wasn't the Greek alphabet that was being used, but the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet did the same thing, that they had numeric values tied to the value of a particular letter. I think that's why when the book of Revelation was written, the conclusion of chapter 3 says, if anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the name, for it's the number of a man, the number is 666. That little hint, if anyone has insight, might have been a kind of a warning to the reader to realize that this is not just a straightforward application of a Greek alphabet numeric value, but actually it's going to be the Hebrew alphabet, which does make it a little bit more hidden. Now, the reason for that, who knows? Maybe they were trying not to be too provocative in the way that this letter would be read, the book of Revelation, although it was pretty provocative either way. But one way or another, it does seem that it is the Hebrew alphabet that's involved. And in fact, if you use the letters of the Greek alphabet and apply them the way it's suggested here, it comes up with a form of the name Nero. It's Kaiser Neron is the way it reads. It would be the accusative case, which would still be a perfectly acceptable standard way of allowing it. Gentry goes into vastly more detail on that and somewhat more technical detail, but fundamentally, I think that's the concept there, that we're dealing with the numeric value of a person's name. In this case, it happens to be in the Hebrew alphabet, and it gets us pretty close to the name of Nero if we apply the rules that way. Does that get at your question?
Absolutely, and I think that even when you start getting into the Latin as well, how it comes out as 616.
Yeah, 616.
Latin manuscripts, yeah. And I think that also points as well to the dating. If they're using the Hebrew, that points to the huge Jewishness of that time. Which kind of speaks to the temple still being around.
Right. That's right.
And there's a whole lot to be said about that.
And the fact that there were some early manuscripts of Revelation that actually swapped in the number 616, precisely to make it more emphatically connect to Nero. That in itself is quite an interesting comment on what at least one particular view, an important view of the matter was in those early years.
Yeah, absolutely. So not to jump around too much, but I would say, so how does Matthew 24 in its entirety, but in particular Matthew 24:34, fit into the scheme of your approach to Revelation?
Well, all three versions of the Olivet Discourse, whether it's Matthew, Mark, or Luke, fundamentally give the same information with certain minor changes here and there, but clearly they're both reporting the same speech that Jesus gave to the disciples that happened to be there. And the discussion is triggered by the disciples pointing out what magnificent stones were used in the construction of the temple. It happens to be Herod's temple, and the stones were just massive. In some cases, multi-ton stones. They were huge. And so the disciples had just heard Jesus basically castigating the religious leaders and saying that their house was left to them desolate, and that, essentially this entire great religious system was going to be going out of business, and the kingdom would be taken from them and given to a nation worthy of it. And the disciples, I think, probably were a little stunned to hear that. And so they're pointing out to Jesus, wait a minute, do you realize what you just said? And these massive stones just seem to argue that there would be a huge amount of permanence here. and that it would be hard to imagine the kind of catastrophes Jesus had just described. And so he says to them, I tell you, the days are coming when not one stone will be left upon another. And the disciples understandably wonder, well, what's that? When is that going to happen? And that gives rise to the Olivet Discourse, in which Jesus lays out in some detail the kinds of events that in fact did take place over the next 40 years or so. Assuming Jesus said that around 30 AD, maybe a little later, he's talking about things that happened: earthquakes, famines, wars, rumors of wars, upheaval. All of those things happened. It's well documented in ancient sources. Tacitus gives us plenty on that. Josephus gives us a fair amount. Suetonius, writing a little later, gives the same information. There's always earthquakes. There's always famines. It's not like that was a unique thing. But I think what Jesus was warning his disciples was that there's going to be these upheavals, that Rome, for all her stability, is going to be going through a somewhat gut-wrenching time in the next few years. Caligula was a whack job and was finally assassinated by his own bodyguards. It was a rough time. And what Roman people had thought was a great edifice and a source of stability was being shaken pretty significantly. But it only got worse. And Jesus, of course, says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then get out of town. Now, any non-Jewish reader would probably look at that and scratch their head. What is this abomination of desolation stuff? And I think Luke, intending to help Gentile readers get it, substitutes in there, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, which is a little more comprehensible. The point is, something would happen, something dramatic. The city of Jerusalem was surrounded by armies in the year 66. The people of the Christian people in Jerusalem recognized that, according to Eusebius, the church historian. They got out of town as Jesus had commanded them to. And then for the next 3 or 4 years, you just have this meltdown, just an awful, spiraling, really catastrophic set of events that culminate in the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, Jesus predicted all that. And those who say, oh, well, Jesus was talking about something that will happen off in the distant future, always run into a huge roadblock, because Jesus himself says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things are fulfilled. Now, the word that's used there in all 3 versions of that account is the Greek word geneia, which is the word translated generation. It is sometimes argued, well, that word can also mean a kind or a race or a species, something like that. And the argument's been made occasionally that, well, what Jesus really meant was this race will not pass away. The Jewish race is not going to disappear. But that is clearly not what it says, and it's not what the word means. There are 2 Greek words. One is the word geneia, feminine noun. The other is the word genos, masculine noun. They both start, you would say, in English letters with G-E-N, like our word gene or something like that. So you've got a common root, but the 2 words are not the same. Geneia means a time-limited generation. It could be anywhere from 25 to 40 years, but it never, ever means a kind or a species in the New Testament. That is not its meaning. It's not its usage. There's no occasion where it is used in that sense. And it's pretty clear from any contextual analysis of the use of that word that that's exactly what is intended. The word genos is a word that is also used in the New Testament. For example, Peter says in 1 Peter, you are a chosen race. Well, in that case, the word genos is used because what Peter means is you are a chosen species of people. You who are the regenerate, you are a certain race. Now, you're not a race in any normal sense, like, your ethnicity or your skin color or any of that. That's not the sense of it at all, but it's talking about being attached to Christ, regenerate, possessed of faith. You are a chosen people, a chosen race. And when the word genos is used otherwise in the New Testament, that's what it means, because that was the meaning of the word. If you look up the two words in Kittle's Theological Word Book of the New Testament, which is the premier academic treatment of the Greek vocabulary of the New Testament, then this point is made with powerful, abundant force. And so those who try to make Jesus say something besides what he actually said are facing essentially an impossible burden of proof. Now, Hal Lindsey came up with a novel concept that what Jesus meant by this generation will not pass away is what he called the fig tree generation. And what he intended by that was a reference to the generation that would see a reconstituted Israel in the future. So when Israel became a nation in 1948, Hal Lindsey, writing about the year 1970 or so, said this is what Jesus meant. He meant that future generation that would see the creation of the state of Israel. That was what he called the fig tree generation. Of course, the difficulty with that is that generation has come and gone decades ago, and still, as far as we know, Jesus hasn't returned. That generation did, in fact, pass away. And even though that was a kind of specious argument in the first place, it's even more specious now that we've moved so far down the road. So, the plain sense of it, the only fair, honest way that the statement by Jesus can be construed is that he meant that generation. What he often called this generation. This generation is a term that Jesus used on various occasions. This generation seeks for signs. This generation uses in various times. It's always referring to that unique generation in the first century that saw the birth of the Christian movement, but it was overlapping with the end game, the end generation of the old covenant. There was a kind of overlapping period in which the new covenant and the old covenant shared a common space and time, but with the removal of Jerusalem, with the dismantling of the temple, with the end of the Levitical priesthood, with the end of the sacrificial system, with the complete elimination of the entire Old Testament Jewish regime, you would have to say the Old Covenant came to a definitive conclusion. And that when the dust settled, the only thing left was the New Covenant, and that was especially the case after 70 AD. And it seems like the great final bell, the final kind of moment, the exclamation point where the one finally ceased and the church had to stand on her own 2 feet, no longer supported by or tethered to Jerusalem, took place in 70 AD. And so from that point on, I think you can say that, that generation passed and we are now in a subsequent time in history.
So I would definitely say that that's a hugely significant point, especially in the fact that it's a whole ideological, cosmological or paradigm shift about how the temple was viewed. Basically, Ralph Bass Jr. I don't know if you've ever read his commentary. Okay, so he did a whole commentary as well on the book Revelation, and he highlights a lot of those key points, like the essentially a divorce and decree being done to Old Covenant Israel, and he covers that, and I'm sure that's in line with David Chilton and the general preterist view of certain interpretations there. But he's because you can't find David Chilton in print anymore.
Yeah. Well,
unfortunately,
he's out there, but you have to buy him in the used bookstores,
Yeah. So I use Logos Bible software a lot, and I found that I found digitally, so I was able to use that.
That's great.
Work my way
Glad to
through
know
it,
that's out there. I appreciate you pointing that out because I'm always looking for good stuff. So
yeah, he does a great job of that. Okay, so there's about 2 more points that I kind of want to cover very briefly, and then I think we'll be good in terms of this interview. One is the Great Tribulation, and where that fits in this, in contrast to the dispensational view,
Sure.
and then I want to talk briefly about the millennium
Okay.
and its significance, and I think we'll be pretty good on this.
Okay. That sounds good.
Yep.
Well, the term the Great Tribulation is used in the Olivet Discourse, all three versions of it, and it's used in Revelation once in chapter 7. Whatever else it is, I think you'd probably say in fairness that the reference to it in the Olivet Discourse and the reference to it in Revelation would, on the face of it, be the same thing. How could you have more than one, the Great Tribulation? It seems as if it's something that would be a unique event. So the question really is, when did it or when will it happen? Jesus, I think, gives, under the rubric of what we were just talking about, the answer, because he says there will be a great tribulation such as has never happened in the history of the world, no, nor ever shall. And then about 3/4 breaths later, he says, this generation will not pass away till all these things are fulfilled. So on the face of it, Jesus puts the Great Tribulation in the first century. The book of Revelation refers to it in chapter 7, in a chapter in which you've got kind of two pieces of a puzzle, because it takes place in the context of what's called the sixth seal. Jesus opens the sixth seal of a scroll, and then there are rather apocalyptic descriptions of what appear to be judgment. The sun turned black, the moon turned to blood, the stars in the sky fell. That sort of thing. The sky receded like a scroll rolling up every island. And that doesn't sound like a Sunday school picnic, my friend. That sounds like a fairly significant and cataclysmic set of events. And that's exactly what it's supposed to communicate. The detail of all of that is given later in Revelation, but kind of the initial overture to it is given there. So just about the time you think that, everything's going to collapse, then the action stops. Chapter 7 is introduced, in which John says he saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or the sea or any tree. And another angel came up from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he told those 4 angels not to harm the land. Don't do this destructive thing until God's people have been marked and protected. Clearly, a Jewish population is in view, as plenty of time is devoted to delineating 12 tribes of Israel. Then we hear later in the chapter of a vast multitude of every nation, tribe, language, and people. When John is asked, who are these? John demurs, beats me, you tell me, he says back to the elder, and the elder says, these are those who have come out of the Great Tribulation. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in history. The Great Tribulation is a way of describing what took place in Jerusalem, probably concentrated in that 5 months of a siege imposed by Vespasian, concluded by Titus, his son, in which inside Jerusalem there was nothing less than the most hellish possible, imaginable circumstances of starvation, of cannibalism, of violence, just insanity that would almost defy description. But we, of course, have pretty good evidence of what happened through the pen of Josephus, who was an eyewitness of all of that. Some people say, well, maybe there's a double fulfillment. Maybe Jesus talks about a great tribulation, but hey, maybe there's going to be another great tribulation later. Except Jesus rules that out. Not every prophecy is susceptible to a double fulfillment, though some may be. But Jesus says there's nothing that's ever been like it, nor will there ever be anything like it. He specifically excludes an idea that this is anything except a one-time, once-for-all event in human history. And on the face of it, then, I think you'd have to say it applies to the horrific circumstances of judgment that befell Jerusalem because they had executed the Son of God, and those who remained unrepentant, although anybody could have repented, the offer was there year after year. But those who didn't face that just gruesome, awful, ghastly end game of Jerusalem that finally culminated in 70 AD. So I think that's what we're dealing with when we deal with the term the Great Tribulation. Does that cover that, or do you want to talk about that more? We can go to the millennium if unless you want to follow up on that.
No, I think that's I think that's good. Yeah, we'll just go straight into the millennium, and then I think we'll be good from there.
Okay. The millennium, of course, literally means 1,000 years. There's only one time in the whole Bible that the idea of 1,000 years is specifically mentioned, and that is in Revelation chapter 20. Now, this is part of where the early premillennial views of eschatology got some help, because there was a tendency to look at Revelation 20 and view it as teaching that there would be 1,000-year reign of Christ, as Jewish tradition had taught. The Jewish tradition that had come down through apocryphal literature and other sources and was quite well known in the first century. It was most of it generated in the 2 or 3 centuries prior to the New Testament era, the Book of Jubilees, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Book of Enoch, and Esdras, and others. You have these various apocryphal writings, not canonical, but they did represent a kind of popular Jewish lore, a sort of Jewish, you might say, the word myth is a little misleading, but kind of a popular view of what was going to happen. And it was quite commonly believed that a Messiah was going to show up. He was going to be political. He was going to be powerful. He was going to be a greater David. He was going to drive off the Romans. He was going to reestablish Israel as a great dominant, maybe the dominant power in the ancient world politically. And that view was quite current. And there was actually an idea that he would rule for 1,000 years. And so the reference in Revelation 20 to 1,000-year reign kind of resonated, especially in the Jewish psyche, as something that they had already thought about. You have enough, however, in Revelation 20 to at least make a thoughtful person pause and go, now, wait a minute, are we still talking about quite the same thing as the Jewish expectation had formulated? And at least I think a fair reading of the text would cause a person to go, this doesn't quite sound like this political reign. It could be that, but it doesn't necessarily drive you to that conclusion. And so the church, while at the beginning had a tendency to view it in those sort of political terms, there was a gradual tendency to say, there may be something else going on here. And that reference to 1,000 years in Revelation 20 could at least, in fairness, be construed to suggest not a political reign of Christ at all, but rather something of a rather different stripe. And it was really Augustine, of course, who was the one that really developed this in a way that became highly influential, but it was already around even earlier. And that would be to say that the reference to 1,000, it was actually, you might actually say that Revelation 20 represents a little bit of a critique of the popular Jewish idea, that it was a kind of mild rebuke of that, saying, you're missing the real sense of what Messiah is going to do, because what he's going to do is basically reduce Satan to a point of inability to deceive the nations, that his power is going to be exercised such that this highly deceptive character who has deluded people and kept them in the dark for centuries is now going to be pushed off into a place where he no longer has that influence, and that's going to take place for a long period of time. It's not the number 1,000 in the Bible, probably as often as not, is understood as a number that is simply to be taken as something big. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, that doesn't mean that God does not own the cattle on the 1,001st hill. That's simply, saying that he owns a lot of cattle, that he's going to be faithful to the 1,000th generation. Well, what about the 1,001st generation? In other words, the number 1,000 often, in fact, possibly more frequently than not, is simply talking about something that is to be taken as expansive. And when Revelation 20 says he threw Satan into the abyss, which is a way of saying locked him back into his own domains, prevented him from having influence in this world for 1,000 years, it'd be perfectly fair to take that as saying that it's simply a reference to the long-term, highly powerful influence of Christ in this world. And I would say it is through the gospel. That the fact is, wherever the gospel is preached, the power of the gospel liberates people from the blindness, the darkness, the confusion, the insanity of life in this world that has been foisted on them by satanic, hellish distortion. The gospel makes people see the world in a rational way. It makes people begin treating each other with respect. It makes people begin realizing that these ridiculous artificial distinctions we've propped up through the years, saying some people are better than others for a variety of reasons that are colossally irrelevant, are false. They're completely misguided distortions of reality, and the gospel is what does that. And so it seems to me that when we think about Revelation 20 and think about it thoughtfully, that it really is more an argument in favor of simply what Christ established in the first century, in the Messianic age, when he ascended to his throne and sent his Holy Spirit and equipped his people to be emissaries of a gospel that would liberate men and women down through history and recreate life on this planet in a way that is infinitely superior to anything that had gone before. We still have some work to do, Aaron. We ain't there yet. I don't know if you noticed
Absolutely.
that, but this is still a work in progress.
Yeah.
It does seem to church history and look at times and places where the gospel has been faithfully preached. The fact of the matter is Satan is bound. That strong man has been plundered. He doesn't have the ability to deceive people anymore. And so it seems to me that that's at least a pretty legitimate way to think about what we sometimes call the millennium.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you the final and probably the most important question for someone who's coming from a dispensationalist point of view. When did this millennium or this millennial reign start?
Okay. Well, I believe that that you would argue that it technically began one day when Jesus said, all authority is given unto me in heaven and earth. You go and make disciples of the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I've commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Well, then Jesus ascended to his throne. 10 days later, he sent his Holy Spirit. The very same day, Peter got up and preached a sermon in Jerusalem, and 3,000 people who had been entrenched in their hostility to Jesus were moved to such a point that they said, men and brothers, what must we do? And I would say there you have your first evidence that Satan had been bound and that the gospel had liberated 3,000 people that way into a new view of what history and what life is all about. And I think the story of church history, you could say, began then and has been continuing. There was still, obviously, that first generation of the growth of the gospel was the last generation of the Old Covenant era. That was a time when it was like people were on the good ship Titanic, and you could stay on the ship and go down, or you could jump off the ship into the lifeboat and be safe. And some people jumped onto the lifeboat, but most didn't, and that ship did go down. But at least I would say that 1,000 years was really, you might even argue it was before that, because certainly Jesus was already casting out demons and displaying just Herculean power against demonic forces. But I think technically, it'd probably be the day that Jesus ascended to his throne. But
Awesome.
interesting, Aaron. I've never actually been asked that question that I can recall in my life. So I'm giving you
Really?
my answer of first impression here, but that's
Well,
a good question. So
well, that makes sense. I mean, that's that's a traditional post mill, sometimes all mill view. So
sure, yeah,
I
yeah.
can I anticipated that, especially with your the heart and love you show for Puritan eschatology.
I
Um,
suppose that, yeah, if you were, it just dawns on me now that you were thinking, well, if I'm post mill, I mean, there is a post millennial view that says history is heading toward an era in the future that would be kind of like a great golden age of the gospel that might last for 1,000 years, and we're not there yet, but we're on our way, and so the millennium is technically, and you know, I'm not. I like that. I'm not opposed to it, and but at the same time, I don't think that Revelation 20 necessarily demands that view. I prefer to say that the view I take is simply a theology of hope. I just believe that the gospel is continuing to have a powerful influence in this world, and that even though we have our ups and downs, the growth, the progress in history is kind of like progress in the stock market. If you invest on Monday, you might lose money before Friday rolls around. But if you invest on Monday of 1970 and you check the market in Monday of the year 2021, you'll find that over the long haul you've actually done okay. And that's kind of the way the growth of the gospel is. It's not something you can measure in little tight bites of 10 or 15 years at a time, but over the whole course of history, 2,000 years of history, there has been an irrepressible and undeniable growth of the gospel that I firmly believe will continue. And I think a time will come when the knowledge of God covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. I don't think it'll probably happen in my lifetime. I'd be happy if it did. But I think that anything we do, you and your ministry and I and mine, could hopefully, by the grace of God, contribute to that growth, and that we can
Absolutely.
die in the firm, joyful expectation that our tiny, minuscule contribution to the building of the kingdom will have effects that may last hundreds of years into the future. So that's kind of my view. And whether there's a millennium out there as such, I'm agnostic on that. I don't know quite what the answer is.
Absolutely. Well, I think that pretty much sums it up. Is there any final words that you would like to leave us with, or
Just blessings on you. I'm glad for your ministry. Appreciate what you're doing, and appreciate where you are in the world, and the service you're providing. So thanks for giving me this opportunity to be with you, and blessings to you and all of those that your ministry touches.
all right, appreciate it, and the same to you. So, yeah, I guess we're gonna call this a wrap, and that's all we got.
Okay.